At number 10, we have Jane Toppan. She was working as a nurse in the 1880s and was often working in the elderly wing of the hospital. Well, she would give them lethal doses of morphine. The reason is unclear as to why, but what makes it worse is that she would often crawl into bed next to the patient as they were passing from the amount of lethal drug she injected them with. She managed to do this to at least 31 patients before she was found out for her crimes. And instead of being arrested or offed for her crimes, she was just committed to asylum, where she lived out the rest of her days. She kicks off our list because in such a short story, there's so much to unpack, like how she would crawl into bed with them, and the thought process behind picking only elderly victims, as well as the fact that she managed to get away with doing it to so many people before being found out is wild. At number 9, we have Walter Freeman. Walter Freeman and his partner in crime, James Watts, are the men behind the lobotomy. It was Freeman's idea in the beginning, and he took inspiration from a Portuguese scientist who had a similar idea, and that of a craniotomy, to create a new form of cure for the mentally unwell. He and Watts started their practice on cadavers, and when they thought they had enough skill to perform it on a living being, they did it publicly to a woman who was complaining of sleeplessness and depression. She lived through it, so it was considered a success, but there were still many trials and errors they had to go through. Freeman wanted to perfect his method, so he started traveling, taking on as many patients as he could across 23 states, performing up to around 20 lobotomies a day on a total of almost 3,500 procedures, causing many fatalities along the way, and was later banned. While he did have good intentions, he couldn't see the danger behind his very invasive procedure. At number 8, we have Linda Hazard. With a last name like Hazard, she really had her work cut out for her, and people should really have been warned. All jokes aside, she was very mentally unwell and convinced people that starvation was a cure-all to any illness. So she owned what people called the Starvation Hotel, where her victims would go and essentially sit in solitude and starve themselves. 40 of her patients passed away from her cure-all, and she was arrested and charged with a couple of different things. She served 2 years in prison, and in 1938, she herself passed away of her own method, because she figured that starvation would be the best answer since she recommended it to so many people. So as awful as her crimes were, what she put out came back to her full force. At number 7, we have Marcel Piot. He was a French physician who was later deemed to be a serial people ender who had a 60-person body count, but it began way further back than that. As a kid, he was expelled from several different schools due to his abnormal behavior, and at the age of 17, he was arrested for mail fraud, but was deemed too mentally unwell to take the stand. He joined the army and was discharged early because of his mental instability, and yet somehow he managed to land an internship with a mental hospital, which caused a lot of controversy because they were using addictive medications and performing some illegal procedures. He himself wasn't actually at the center of any of these allegations, but it's what led to him opening his own clinic. But that's not exactly where the problem started either. Someone reported him to the police for having a very foul stench coming from his home, and having some dark plumes of smoke coming from his chimney that carried the smell across the neighborhood. Well, when the police investigated, they found body parts in his fireplace, which called for his immediate imprisonment. And his head rolled in 1946 because his crimes were deemed too gruesome for him to be left alive. At number 6, we have Shiro Ishii. He was a microbiologist and a lieutenant general in the biological warfare unit for the Japanese army in the Second Japanese War. He started his experiments in 1942, some of which included exposing prisoners and civilians to diseases like the plague and anthrax, and even found ways to simulate strokes and heart attacks. So he was basically practicing life-threatening procedures on often unwilling patients. Thousands of them lost their lives to his endeavors. After the Second World War, he was taken into custody by the American Armed Forces, but in a questionable turn of events, he was given immunity in exchange for his medical knowledge. So he would never be allowed to perform medically, but overall was not punished for being the cause of passing to thousands of people. At number 5, we have Harold Shipman. He found an interest in medical practice at a young age and earned his medical degree, but was forced to give up the practice as he was addicted to one of the prescription medications and was forging prescriptions for himself. After this, he moved to Hyde and was once again thriving in general practice. One of the local undertakers noticed a very unsettling pattern though. They noticed that a lot of the clients they had coming in were patients of Shipman's and were all found in similar positions and places. Well, they let the local police know, and an investigation investigation was performed, but they didn't find anything against him, until an 81-year-old woman was found. What's so odd about this? She made Shipman the main beneficiary of her will. The police believed it was forged because Shipman was at her home and had only been there just hours before. When an examination was done of the woman, they discovered she passed of a morphine overdose just 3 hours prior, which would have been when Shipman was in her home. Another thing the police found suspicious was that he would always try and convince the families of his patients to cremate them, and when questions were raised, he would use an altered document saying it's what they would have wanted. Police also asked about the untimely nature of his appearance when his patients were passing, and he claimed that he received emergency phone calls that were made, but there was no recorded phone calls to prove his case. He was originally convicted for 15 counts of offing people, but that number later jumped to 236. He ended up dangling himself from his jail cell shortly after his conviction because I guess he couldn't live with himself anymore. At number 4, we have John Bodkin Adams. He was a British doctor who was known for being very generous and sympathetic with his patients, especially the elderly ones. Because a lot of them didn't have much family or felt indebted to him, they would leave him small amounts of their will. When he would find these out, his patients would mysteriously pass away, and he would claim his part of their inheritance. Coincidence? Absolutely not. He was pumping them full of substances that caused their lives to end. He got away with this until 1956, when police began to investigate because they caught on to his scheme. They found dozens of people linked to him, but only 2 of them had large inheritance. When the bodies were analyzed, they only had prescription drugs in them, so he couldn't really be tried with anything. But he was found guilty of forging prescriptions and falsifying medical forms. He was eventually allowed to reopen, but he lost almost all of his elderly clients. How he managed to get away with this is frankly beyond me. At number 3, we have Michael Swango. He was once an American doctor who was convicted for being the cause of passing to 3 of his patients, even though over 60 of his patients lost their lives because of him. He had a fascination with blood and fatality, which was reflected in his medical career. He had an internship at the Ohio State University, but the other nurses working there observed the patients mysteriously passing away that were his. And after the investigation, they established that he was in fact the problem and he was expelled. After this, he moved to Illinois, where he had poisoned his colleagues. He was caught once again and sentenced. After he was released, he forged illegal documents to move to Zimbabwe, where he once again became a doctor and started offing his patients once again. Of course, he was found out and was on the lam for a while until he was caught in 1997 and given a life sentence. As terrible as it is, he was seriously determined, and that's what's even scarier. At number 2, we have Janine Jones. She was a vocational nurse in the 70s and 80s, and while she was working in Texas, she was the cause of between 11 and 46 heart attacks in infants. You may be thinking, how could one do such a thing? Well, she was injecting them with different types of drugs that would cause their little hearts to go into overdrive and stop. There were 11 confirmed and up to 46 suspected, which is far too much. She was discovered for her crimes and was sentenced to 99 years in prison, which she fulfilled and was eligible for release in 2018 because of overcrowding. But prosecutors went out of their way to find older charges on her name to keep her locked up. The fact that she was heartless enough to go out of her way to stop the new generation of life is crushing, and we're thankful that she is still locked up. And last but not least, at number 1, we have H.H. Holmes. He was a medical student who was dubbed as America's first serial life ender. He did briefly practice as a doctor in Pennsylvania, but in 1893, at the Chicago World Fair, keep that date in mind, he took the lives of somewhere between 9 and 27 people. I'm sorry, but those are 2 very different numbers, and the fact that they couldn't confirm most of them is highly concerning as well. He managed to get away with these because he had a designated room in his house that he used to make the process easier, and he would use what he knew in medical practice to successfully dispose of the remains. In the time he was performing medicine, he racked in around 200 victims, getting away with almost all of them. But he was found out for his crimes, and he was strung up for his crimes in 1996. That's 3 years after he started working in Chicago. 200 victims in 3 years means that he had a victim every 5.5 days. And that is why he places number 1 on the list.
Is crossbreeding ethical? I'll let you be the judge. Back in the 1920s, a Soviet biologist named Ilya Ivanov tried to crossbreed humans with various other primate species. He was responsible for groundbreaking breakthroughs with artificial insemination, and with his use of insemination, he was able to use a stallion's sperm to fertilize up to 500 mares. Most stallions could only father like 20 to 30 if you were just doing it the natural way. This made him very popular among horse breeders, who came all the way from around the globe to work with them. He had more ambitions than just horse breeding though, and his interest revolved around hybridization between species. More specifically, Ivanov wanted to see if humans could reproduce with their closest known relatives. So he decided the best route to take with his project was to inject several female chimpanzees and orangutans with human, output. He started his experiments when they were green-lit by the Soviet Department of Scientific Institutions in 1926. None of his subjects succeeded in becoming pregnant, but determined to try again, Ivanov then tried to experiment with human woman and ape, output. However, he wasn't able to put his plans into motion from both opposition from his superiors and the death of his last orangutan donor. Any further tests were prevented when Ivanov was hit by a purge and ended up exiled and imprisoned in what is now Kazakhstan. Also known as the Angel of Death, Dr. Joseph Mengele was an anthropologist and physician who conducted numerous inhumane medical experiments on the prisoners under his watch. At the famous death camp he worked at, he was one of a number of medical professionals who selected victims to be sentenced to the gas chambers or be spared for his experimental research. He would attempt red fluid transfusions from one twin to the other, do amputations to try and sew it onto the other twin, stitch 2 twins together to form Siamese twins, infect one twin with typhus or another disease, and way too many other experiments. To the surprise of nobody, more often than not, the twins died during the procedures, or he would have them killed afterwards just to do an autopsy. If one twin died from a disease, he would often just kill the other to mark the differences between the sick and healthy subjects. The evil doctor was also very interested in heterochromia, where people have irises of different colors, and he would collect eyes and body parts of his victims and send them off for research. He would inject chemicals into victims' eyes to attempt to change their eye color. He also experimented on pregnant women before sending them off to the chambers, and caused pregnancies between family members, always under the guise of research. He also tried removing and operating on victims without anesthesia. Oh, and if that wasn't all disgusting enough, he tried to prove that Jewish and Romani people were genetically inferior through his morbid experimentation. While he was employed by the SS, Joseph sent his colleagues in Germany red fluids, body parts, organs, skeletons, and even more that had all been taken from folks under his care. Cynthia Crawford was born a fraternal twin with totally different red fluid type and tissue type than her twin sister. Now, unlike her twin, she was born without an amniotic sac, which baffled the medical community. Turns out, prior to her coming into this world, her father had been approached by agents within the OSS to participate in a secret government project. And it wasn't until she was in her mid-30s that she learned from her father that she was a hybrid created in a petri dish by a government program that utilized DNA from 2 different alien races added to human DNA. Throughout Cynthia's early years, she was taken to underground military medical facilities at night for testing and examinations. And during this time and throughout her life, she also encountered what she believed were alien abductions, examinations, impregnations, as well as miraculous healing and organ replacements. Throughout the 1950s and into the late 1970s, Cynthia tried to seek help and understanding of her experiences, but there were no support groups at that time, and she really couldn't find anybody who would believe her. She was chastised for having and using psychic powers, but her life changed when she gave up fear to consciously face those otherworldly beings. And that's when she learned they were her star family. They awakened her to the truth of her mission that brought her to this planet at this very special time in history. In 2003, Cynthia began making sculptures with the assistance of the various benevolent star beings that she had encountered and that other contactees had experienced. Cynthia dedicated her life to counseling, workshops, and talks, teaching everybody how we're connected to the star people and how to live in an integrated galactic society in the very near future. Sadly, she passed away in 2018, or maybe she just left her mortal body to be with her star family. The first successful human-animal hybrid was developed in a laboratory dish in Shanghai back in 2003. A team of scientists fused human cells in rabbit eggs, creating the embryos of a new creature that was half rabbit and half human. The research, reported by a scientist in China, was fiercely condemned by pro-life campaigners who described it as barbaric. More than 100 of the hybrids are said to have been made by fusing human skin cells with rabbit eggs. The resulting embryos were allowed to develop in laboratory dishes for several days before the scientists killed them to extract embryonic stem cells. These are the body's master cells, with the potential to become any kind of tissue. Experts hope in the future they can be used to grow replacement cells for treating a wide range of diseases such as Parkinson's and diabetes. Scientists in the US have previously mixed human cells and cow's eggs in a similar attempt to generate a source of embryonic stem cells, without success. At one point, there was another team of scientists that reported the creation of a hermaphrodite embryo containing male and than female cells. The Chinese scientists described their success in an edition of Cell Research. Now, the vast majority of DNA in the embryos was human, but the rabbit eggs contained a small amount of DNA contained outside the nucleus in the rod-like bodies, good old mitochondria, which supply energy. Now, there was a pro-life charity that reacted with disgust at the news. Look, these guys weren't the first people to try it. They were just the first to pull it off. It was unique when compared to other experiments, because the vast majority of the DNA was human. Once again, just a small amount of DNA was taken from rabbits, meaning that whatever came out would have been more man than animal, but the world never got to see what they made. It's one thing to give a pig a human lung, but one experiment blurred the lines between human and animal in a way that no other has. In 2014, a team of researchers gave mice millions of human brain cells. The researchers replaced almost every cell in the mouse brains with human cells, leaving only the original mouse neurons intact. Once inside, the human cells almost completely took over the mouse brains. Within a year, their cells had been completely replaced by the human brain cells. Each mouse had about 12 million human cells at work inside their strange hybrid brains. Now, scientists ran some really horrible tests on the mice. In their main experiment, the researchers played a noise before attacking the mice with an electric shock. Then scientists measured how the mice reacted the next time that they heard the, angry sound. It was very twisted. But it did show the researchers that the memories of those modified mice were 4 times stronger than those of a normal mouse. In 2009, there were scientists in Russia and Belarus who genetically modified goats to produce human milk. They weren't able to make the milk 100% human-made, but they were able to fill it with human cells, creating milk that had 60% of the elements that characterize human milk. And they weren't the only folks who did it. Shortly after, a Chinese team made a whole herd of like 300 cattle that produced human milk. Now, the goal was to get this human milk on grocery store shelves. The scientists wanted a way to harvest human milk on an assembly line. They were kind of positive that people would flock to the stores for the chance to buy a bottle for their family. Heck, the Russian team even advertised that its human milk made delicious cheese. The Chinese team originally planned to have their product in stores by 2014, but a lukewarm reception pushed back their plan. These days, they're just working on convincing the world that human milk coming from a mutant cow is something worth buying. And once they do, you'll be able to pick it up. Zonkies and zedonks have been on the market for many years. They were raised by Charles Darwin and are mentioned in his work Origin of Species, written back in 1859. Before Darwin's time, there was a man named Lord Morton who crossbred horses in 1815, and those hybrids existed in captivity for many years. So just so you know, a zonkie is a cross between a zebra male and a female donkey, whereas a zedonk is the offspring of a donkey male and a female zebra. Don't get them confused. These species are intermediate between parent species and contain characteristics from both. So for instance, they possess the straight black and white striping of the zebra, while still having the muscular and stocky body of a donkey. Despite their appearance, they're really fascinating creatures if we're talking behavior. It's pretty obvious, zebras are wild animals, they're very aggressive, and therefore you can't really tame that easily. So the crossbreed of these species also affects the growth of the aggressive qualities. They have some useful features. They have the stamina of a donkey, and once again, the speed and strength of a zebra. This can make them useful work animals that can be used to pull heavy loads. Yes, the utility of these creatures is kind of questionable, and there's more points concerning, such as their ethical creation and imprisonment.
Number 10, the mob doctor. Led by Italian immigrant cousins Herman and Paul Petrillo, Dr. Bulwer was part of the infamous Philadelphia poison ring in 1930s. The cousins had contacts in the criminal world where they knew Harold, an expert counterfeiter and an arsonist, while Paul ran an insurance scam business from the back of his tailoring shop. Dr. Bulwer believed in magic, where they gave potions to patients to better their lives. The magic called La Fattura, the cousins started issuing insurance policies without medical exams and would pay the doctor to poison these patients with potions which were actually arsenic inside. The insurance would go to the gang instead of the patient's widowed wives or their families, and they would also hire killer thugs who would murder others through various means such as drowning, bludgeoning, and running over the victims by car. The crimes began in 1931 and an estimated 30 to 50 people were killed. Dr. Bulwer was arrested in 1939 and turned state evidence onto the cousins who were sentenced to death. Number 9, the euthanasia doctor. When it comes to choosing life or death, the patient has the right to discuss the terms, or the family does, in regards to their condition. But in some cases, the concept of euthanasia has been debatable, as it is unsure if it was the patient who decided it or the doctor at hand, especially in the case of Jack Kevorkian, who was actually a known US pathologist and an advocate of euthanasia. While many may debate on this, he was responsible for the deaths of more than 100 patients when no laws existed. He ended up being sentenced up to 8 years in prison for his actions. Early in his career, he fell under criticism when he proposed medical experiments on death row inmates where they were still alive. These experiments would be performed while the inmates were conscious and in their fatality. He argued that ending these prisoners' lives lives early could provide a service to humanity before their death, and so for his views, his peers had dubbed him as Dr. Death. He would also follow up his research with an invention of what he called a suicide machine, where he made it from materials costing up to only $45 and 3 bottles of solutions filled with saline and a painkiller. The fatal dose would be potassium chloride, and he became infamous when Janet Adkins sought him out after discovering she had Alzheimer's. But way before she was actually succumbing to the symptoms, he went ahead and carried out the act of her committing herself. He died at the age of 83, only serving 8 years of a 25-year sentence due to good behavior. Number 8. The abortionist killers. Well, in Philadelphia, there was a physician who was well known for providing an abortion to immigrants and minorities, and his name was Dr. Kermit Gosnell. In the 1970s, he was an early advocate for abortion's rights, and he decided to open his clinic 2 years later for the cause, the Women's Medical Society. His practice, however, was under unsanitary conditions, untrained staff, and the use of powerful drugs without appropriate supervisions. They found half-conscious women waiting for a procedure, moaning in bed on red fluid-covered recliners, fetal parts in milk and orange juice containers, medications past their expiry dates, and staff who could not tell the investigators what dose of medications they had just administered, and even flea-infested cats. Additionally, Gosnell admitted that at least 10% to 20% of the abortions were performed after 24 weeks over the legal limit. In 2010, Gosnell's medical license was suspended, and he was arrested in 2011. He was charged with many counts, including third degree of an adult patient, multiple first degrees of babies, and criminal enterprises for illegally prescribing and dispensing controlled substances. It was estimated that he made an additional $10,000 to $15,000 per night for illegal prescribing, and he was sentenced to 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Number 7. The starvation doctor. Although she was not a medical doctor, she received a license to practice medicine through a loophole that granted practitioners of alternative medicine. Also known as Dr. Linda Burfield Hazard, she believed that fasting, or scientific fasting, as she would write 2 books on the subject, was essential for better health. She created her own sanitarium where inpatients would fast for days, weeks, and even months on small amounts of tomato, asparagus juice, and if they're lucky, a small teaspoon of orange juice. The patients were also given daily enemas, as well as massages that the nurses would even say sounded like beatings. Under her care, over 40 patients had passed away, and she claimed that they died of previous undiagnosed conditions. She was convicted of manslaughter for the death of wealthy British women who lost 50 pounds, and it was even discovered that Hazard forged a woman's will to make her the beneficiary and stole the patient's valuables. She died in 1935. Number 6. The kill for inheritance doctor. In Essex, there was a general practitioner named Dr. Adams, otherwise known as John Bodkin Adams. He was considered to be a compassionate and kind to his elderly patients. However, he started to like using dangerous drugs and expressed an abnormalities in interest in his patients' wills. In 1956, police began to investigate Adams under suspicion he was getting rid of his elder patients for their inheritance. And although they found dozens of cases, they were actually able to only charge him for 2, and the patients had willed large sums of money to Adams, and their causes of death remained unclear. Ultimately, Adams was not convicted, but was found guilty for forgery of their prescriptions and falsifying medical documentation. He was able to reopen his practice, but many elderly patients just decided to not work with him ever again for obvious reasons. And because of this, his case had left a significant impact on criminal trials in England. Number 5. America's first serial killer. It's like every account of someone doing some heinous crime is considered America's first serial killer, but there's so many, I don't even know who really came first. It's like every account of someone doing some heinous crime is considered America's first serial killer, but there's so many, I don't even know who really came first. But in this case, when it comes to malpractice, maybe H.H. Holmes was the first serial killer in America who was a doctor. His fascination in medicine, or what you'd consider medicine, started out when he would operate on animals at a young age. His fascination in medicine, or what you'd consider medicine, started when he operated on animals at a young age. It was also speculated he killed his childhood playmate, and after finishing medical school, he took a job as a pharmacist in Chicago. He soon started killing people and stole their property and developed his own house where it considered many secret passageways, trapdoors, soundproof rooms, a door that locked from the outside, and he had rooms with gas jets to asphyxiate his victims and a whole kiln to cremate the bodies. He became friendly with women during the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893, where he would prey on them, take their finances, and eventually send them to their deaths. He would require all of the employees to take out their life insurance policies, naming him as the beneficiary, and many of the bodies he sold to medical schools. This was the 1800s, and not a lot of people seem to suspect, and it wasn't until 1893 where he was arrested for insurance fraud for a fire in his home. There, it was discovered of all the crimes he had committed, and he was sentenced to death. Although the number is unknown, it has been estimated 200 victims laid under H.H. Holmes' hand. Number 4. The father of lobotomy. Although he had no surgical training, he did work with other surgeons. Walter Freeman was an American physician and advocate of psychosurgery alongside Dr. James W. Watts. He became the first in the US to perform a prefrontal lobotomy by craniotomy in the operating room. Looking for a quicker, easier way to perform the procedure, he perfected the transorbital lobotomy. This procedure would render the patients unconscious by electroshock, and Freeman would use an actual ice pick from his own kitchen, designed and implemented the stronger orbital cast. These instruments would be inserted into the back of the eye orbits and then hammered into the skull. They would be wiggled back and forth in order to sever connections to the prefrontal cortex and the frontal lobes of the brain. This left patients to a vegetative state and reduced their behavior to childlike mannerisms. As a result, over 490 people had died. Freeman allowed the media to watch a procedure in which a patient died when the ice pick slipped into the brain. He was noted to act indifferently and move on to the next patient, and his license was eventually revoked after the death of a patient. He died of cancer in 1972. Number 3. Dr. Death. Born and trained in India, Jayant Patel was a surgeon where he started his practice in Buffalo, New York. He was fined and placed on 3-year probation for not examining his patients prior to surgery. His New York license was eventually revoked in 2001, where he moved to Oregon in 1989. He actually fell under scrutiny, and 8 cases led to malpractice or wrongful deaths. Claimed of his coworker states that he'd operate on other patients that weren't even on his roster and were registered other surgeons. He operated unnecessary and caused serious injury and death. His practice was restricted, prohibiting from operating on the liver or pancreas and requiring a second opinion for other surgeries. After reviewing 4 cases resulting in 3 patient deaths, the Oregon Board of Medicine made the restriction state. However, he was able to cut through corners and get hired by Queensland Health under the Area of Need program and not disclosing his actual credentials. His malpractices, though, were immediately noticed, and the nurses said that hide their patients from him whenever he was in the hospital. His malpractices, though, were immediately noticed, and nurses were said to hide their patients from him whenever he was in the hospital. In 2005, the media got wind of the news and deaths connected to him, and when he arrived back to Portland, a magistrate sent an issue for his arrest. 2008, Patel was extradited and convicted, but somehow his conviction was overturned on appeal. The outstanding charge in 2013 came into light, and he was finally pleaded guilty for the 4 charges of fraud and sentenced 2 years in prison. But it was wholly suspended because of the time he had already served in jail for the convictions that were overturned by the High Court of Australia. In 2015, he was barred from practicing medicine in Australia. However, there are no updates where this malpractitioner is now. Number 2. Dr. Satan. Marcel Pitot, otherwise known as Dr. Satan, was a highly intelligent child throughout exhibiting some abnormal behavior, to the point where he was expelled from school, and when he was 17, he was arrested for mail fraud but was found mentally unfit to stand for trial. He was then able to join the army, where he was caught stealing blankets but wasn't convicted due to reasons of insanity, and he was then later discharged from the army. Eventually, somehow, he was able to gain a medical degree in 1921. 2 of his patients had died under his care, but he was never charged, and although he became the mayor, somehow he also became a mayor in France, he was dismissed twice and lost his seat when he was found stealing power from the city. He continued his crimes in 1933, where he moved to Paris to enrich himself, and when World War II struck, he offered to help Jewish escapees from the now occupied France. But he would lie to them, claiming the medicine he was providing would help prevent diseases, but it was actually poison. He would watch them die slowly as he would rob them and their valuables. He would then stuff their bodies in a furnace in the basement of his house, and in 1943 he was arrested, but then later released after several months. After the liberation of France in 1944, he was arrested again after the 30 corpses were found in his basement. He admitted to killing 60 people, but was convicted for 26. He was guillotined in 1946. They still do that in France. Number 1. The Angel of Death. In World War II, during the reign of the German leader's regime, they were obsessed with the idea of the only superior race was those who had pale skin and blue eyes. Joseph Mengele received his medical degree in 1938, the same year he joined the regime. He volunteered to be part of the medical service with the armed forces. However, all of this military activities are still not clear from this time. After being discharged as a medical officer due to his injuries, he enrolled to work for the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Genetics, and Eugenics. He was promoted to being an SS captain and was transferred to the concentration camps, where he performed multiple rounds in which he would make selections which prisoner would be sent to the work or to the chambers. He was known as the Angel of Death for his cruel demeanor, and while off duty, he would look for twins for his experiments. His research included injecting chemicals into living persons to see if they could change their eye color. He was obsessed with eyes of different colors and would collect eyes of victims who were killed. He would collect body parts of those who died, natural illnesses to study, as well as their organs. He fled Auschwitz after the Soviets invaded in 1945 and was able to hide under an alias and died in 1979 in Argentina. A victim and survivor of Auschwitz once said, "When he smiled, you knew he meant danger because when he was smiling, he was at his most sadistic."
Since it's literally in the name, Oppenheimer will be opening this list at number 10. Yeah, you can hate me in the comments for that one. So, born into a bread and butter white picket fence family in 1904, J. Robert Oppenheimer's bland start fueled his drive for knowledge, and he excelled in a broad range of subjects. He earned a Harvard degree in 1925 and a doctorate from Göttingen in 1927, and he took on a joint position between Caltech and Berkeley in 1930. The bulk of Oppenheimer's work during these eras of his life focused on the blossoming field of quantum mechanics, specifically experimental nuclear physics. The fall of France in 1940 horrified him, and he felt a deep obligation to join the American forces as a result. Oppenheimer was appointed the leader of the Manhattan Project in early 1942 and began searching for the brightest nuclear physicists, chemists, and engineers in the United States. What makes Oppenheimer a mad scientist isn't the fact that he achieved probably the only technological achievement that rivaled the computer using only theoretical principles since they were too broke for real supplies. It was actually A, he recognized what they were creating and the extent of it, but proceeded to because he felt it was the right thing to do to take vengeance. B, the misconception he regrets dropping that thing. He doesn't. As stated, Oppenheimer felt it was a correct for vengeance. He does, however, regret creating something that began the arms race of all arms race and encouraged bigger and more deadly weaponry that humanity wouldn't understand the extent of nor be able to control. And C, he chose a test site, aka Trinity, for the NB that was populated by indigenous people. It was not unpopulated, and the film is actually perpetuating this inaccuracy. The Trinity site is more than 200 miles away from Los Alamos and White Sands, New Mexico, and what people weren't forced off their land for a mere $7 from the government were still there when the NB was tested. If I have to explain to you why that warrants being dubbed a mad scientist, we got some other problems here. Alright, well, that's a bummer to start with. Let's try and lighten things up with number 9, alien seedlings. See, doesn't that sound so promising? But it starts off relatively normal at first. So, along with James D. Watson, Francis Crick will forever be remembered as one of the discoverers of the very structure of DNA. February 28th of 1953, which made Crick climb up out of his seat and declare to the assembled lunch patrons at the Eagle that they had found the secret of life. The two men had met while they were working together at the University of Cambridge, and in 1962 they received a Nobel Prize for their scientific work. A coin toss between the two of them had decided the order in which they would even be named as authors. But you can learn more about this in the Bumblebee video, the top 10 most significant scientific breakthroughs in history, and maybe while you're at it, subscribe to The Hive to see more of the Bumblebee science videos. Anyways, Crick was arguably amongst the finest minds in science, which is what makes his later beliefs a little bit more difficult to fathom. At some point in the 1970s, Crick became an advocate of one of the weirdo pseudoscience theories of all time. He called it direct panspermia, and it's the premises that life on Earth was deliberately seeded by aliens. However, this theory states how life spread, not how life began. Crick and Leslie Orgel proposed their directed panspermia theory at a conference on communication with extraterrestrial intelligence in 1971, a theory they described as highly unorthodox proposal and a bold speculation, as they presented it as a plausible scientific hypothesis. Crick repeatedly addressed this question and the origin of life between 1971 and 1988. On to number 8, we have the scientist who loved to make 'em dance. In the world of scientists, Giovanni Aldini was a punk rocker with a lip piercing you wouldn't want to take home to mom. At a time when electricity was still a new invention, Aldini traveled across Europe with the sole purpose of electrifying subjects. This may sound horrific, and it was, but it was all in the pursuit of science, as explained by science historian Ewan Morris. He'd spent most of the last decade working to exonerate his uncle, the great Luigi Galvani, who had been dismissed from the faculty at the University of Bologna, hilarious, for refusing to swear allegiance to Napoleon. After losing his position, he died penniless a year later. Aldini's mission was to prove his uncle's theory of galvanism, or the medical use of electricity to stimulate nerves and muscles. And in that mission, Aldini became an entertainer who gave audiences a rare spectacle of witnessing what happens to corpses when they're electrocuted. In a demonstration, Aldini would attach electric nodes to observe how the body reacts. When attached to a human head or an ox head, the facial muscles would contort, the teeth would chatter, the eye sockets even pop out. When the body was involved, limbs and parts moved in motion, giving the impression that the organism was reanimating. Yet, besides his antics, Aldini was one of the few scientists that actually does manage to learn to cure mental illness with electroshocks. His curious and interesting experiments indicated the power of electricity in science. science. It's in the name, y'all. Number 7 will be Mad Match. We need a lady on the list, and why not do one who may as well have been the Judith Shakespeare, centuries before Virginia Woolf exhorted women to find a room of one's own. Essentially, she wasn't mad, she was just a woman, that's all there is to it. Margaret Cavendish was one of the first women to write using her own name and the only woman to publish her own natural philosophy in the 17th century. And she's also the first woman to be invited to the newly formed Royal Society. Madge was a controversial figure in the 17th century, but despite the scandal her writing life caused, she had a grand total of 13 books ranging from poems and fancies, the first book of poetry published by a woman under her own name, to Blazing World, the first science fiction by a woman. She acquired a reputation for eccentricity as well. In addition to her writing, she designed her own clothes, swore like a trucker, and was a friendly flirt despite her very, very loving marriage to William Cavendish, who paid for all of her publications. As a result, Cavendish was often called Mad Madge, but Madge wasn't crazy. As said, she was just a very intelligent woman in an anti-intelligent women era, and maybe a little socially inept. On one occasion, Cavendish was pondering upon the natures of mankind, to quote her, and decided to write down all the positive qualities possessed by one of her friends on a piece of paper, and on another all of her friend's negative qualities. Cavendish then decided to send her friend the list of positive qualities as a kind gesture, which she assumed would be appreciated. Unfortunately, she accidentally sent the wrong list and sent her homegirl a list of her worst flaws. Naturally, said friend was pretty furious. Number 6 is zany and brainy. It's the notorious Nikola Tesla. So, he attended the Austrian Polytechnique in Graz but never graduated, and potentially really was the most inventive and zaniest scientist who ever lived. Some of his saner research included extensive work on AC electrical current and studies involving X-rays. When not producing bolts of artificial lightning that measured up to 135 feet long to kill elephants. If you don't know the story of Topsy, take to the internet or watch the weirdly accurate but also hilarious Bob's Burgers cartoon episode about it. Tesla worked on inventions such as the particle gun that he believed might bring down tens of thousands of airplanes, or anti-gravity flying machines. As he got older, Tesla's OCD condition did worsen, and it began to amalgamate with his scientific side more than ever. Mental obsessions are often associated with behavioral compulsions performed according to rigid rules. Tesla felt driven to perform repetitive behaviors such as doing everything in sets of 3, but also developed habits and aversions such as calculating the cubic contents of all the food on his plate before eating, or a touch phobia to human hair. Famously, the renowned inventor believed he had been in contact with extraterrestrials from Venus, and he also managed to fall head over heels in love with a pigeon of whom he insisted felt mutually. And now moving on to the creepiest guy on this list, the brain implant guy is number 5. University of Madrid graduate Jose Delgado may have received a prestigious professorship at Yale University, but his research at the venerable institution's physiology department was, I don't know, the makings of a complete movie level supervillain? Like microchips in the brain, let's control humanity type of vibe. In 1950s and 60s, Delgado inserted electro implants into the brains of primates and used a remote control that gave off radio frequencies to make the animals perform complicated movements in arms, legs, and face. Later, Delgado decided to be even more insane. He implanted this into the brain of a bull, which he then got into a ring with, pissed it off, and then used the transmitter to stop the bull dead in its tracks when it charged at him. Terrifying stuff. Perhaps most alarmingly of all, Delgado also wired up the brains of 25 people. 25 people let this guy in their skull. Behaviorally, this device only impacted people's aggression, but he kept striving for a way to achieve mind control, because as this supervillain once stated, we must electronically control the brain. Someday, armies and generals will be controlled by electric stimulation. And what better way to follow that up than with nymphs and giants? Number 4. Paracelsus, just one name like Cher or Madonna, was a learned man of the Renaissance, earning a doctorate from the Uni of Ferrara in the early 16th century. Seen as the father of modern toxology, Paracelsus was a practicing physician, botanist, and occultist, the latter of which can be given direct credit for his weird stunt experiments. Paracelsus was convinced that he could create a living homunculus, a tiny man, by keeping man juice in a warm place and feeding it his human blood. He even left instructions for any others who might wish to try it, and fervently believed that this method was the genesis of wood nymphs and giants. Science may have been a lot less advanced 100 years ago, but this was still a pretty bizarre hypothesis then. Number 3 was willing to do anything, evidently. It's the Dino Diner. William Buckland, graduate of Corpus Christi College, Oxford, a contemporary of Charles Darwin, remembered as the first man to pen a complete description of a fossilized dinosaur, the Megalosaurus, and an aspiring Anthony Bourdain? If you could eat it with less of an 80% chance of it killing you, William Buckland put it in his mouth. Like the world's craziest oral fixation, this man ate a list that included roast hedgehog, potted ostrich, panthers, porpoises, puppies, bugs, cockroaches, snakes, and even bat urine. Garden moles, though, were apparently a bridge too far because they were ugly, so there was no way that could taste good. However, perhaps Buckland's greatest gustatory achievement was reportedly having eaten the shrunken heart of King Louis XIV, a distinction arguably that overshadows his account of the Megalosaurus, if it's true. Number 2 is about these two peas in a space pod. So, the story of rocket scientist Jack Parsons is so monumentally insane that it's tempting to think that Quentin Tarantino is pulling another fast one on us. But somehow, this California Institute of Technology researcher's personal life is real and wildly well documented. The crazy train starts in 1939 when Parsons very suddenly converted to Thelema, a philosophy religion developed by the famed Aleister Crowley. I talked about this religion in the recent Bumblebee video, Historic Sorcerers That Actually Had Powers, if you do want to learn more. Parsons, together with his occult roomies, were spotted many times, nakedly dancing around fires in his garden. And because crazy knows no bound, Jack Parsons went from Aleister Crowley type of crazy to Tom Cruise kind of crazy. Oh yeah, that's right, Jack joined up with Scientology founder L. Robert Hubbard. Why? Oh, you know, just to raise the mother of the Antichrist. Yeah, if you guys don't really know what Scientology is, your favorite celebrities believe in crap like raising Antichrist mothers. Go enjoy Handmaid's Tale now that you know that. So, to raise an Antichrist mother scientifically, of course, because this is science, Parsons yanked his proverbial chain while Hubbard wrote notes on it. A moment of silence, please. Then the pair also believed that they could summon spirits while Hubbard intoned next to Parsons having intercourse with his side piece. And then when Hubbard later absconded with Parsons' side piece, the scientist reported that he was trying to hex his foe. All of this wild malarkey thankfully comes to an end when Parsons was sadly eventually killed in an explosion, but some have suggested that it was actually caused by a magic experiment. And what better way to finish off than with number 1, the Monkey Man. You may be wondering, what could be crazier than Jack Parsons' escapades? Well, Soviet biologist Ilya Ivanov is here and he says to hold his vodka. In 1924, the Bolshevik government granted Ivanov permission to leave the country for the express governmentally funded purpose of breeding hybrid ape humans. So let's go over this again. The government gave a scientist money and resources, and everyone agreed it was to make a half human, half ape. This is real. And then in the summer of 1926, Ivanov, now in Paris, grafted a woman's ovary into a chimp named Nora and tried to, you know, get her pregnant with some injected human man stuff. Sorry, y'all ain't got a better allowable name for it, so just work with me here. In November that year, still being 1926, I'm just gonna keep reiterating times and places because this is real and I'm struggling to conceive that. Ivanov traveled to Africa and put some human man juice into a trio of chimps. None of these animals ever fell pregnant, thank God, and a frustrated Ivanov figured it doesn't work one way, maybe it'll work another. So he changed tactics, instead putting out a notice for Soviet women who were willing to be fertilized with chimp stuff. Something for which he acquired no less than 5 volunteers, of whom I would like to have private conversations with. However, before the experiments could get properly underway, a Stalinist removal of scientists resulted in Ivanov being sent away to Kazakhstan in exile, unable to finish his experiment, where then he died within 2 years of his arrival. Thank God.